Let's talk about Freud. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist, best known as the founder of psychoanalysis, and also a total motherfucker. What do you mean I'm not allowed to say that? Freud developed many theories in his time studying psychoanalysis, including his most famous, the Oedipus complex. But we'll talk about that later. First, let's go over his theory of the unconscious mind. Now, before we start, while psychoanalytics is very important to psychological history, it's not at all scientifically supported, which is why most professionals these days don't use psychoanalytic therapies. Freud's theories are very interesting, but they're not backed up by any kind of measurable data. Freud believed that all of your thoughts and behaviors were heavily influenced by the unconscious mind. He proposed that the unconscious mind was a part of your psyche that you were completely unaware of, and yet it affected your preconscious and conscious mind. The preconscious being the part of your mind that you're not aware of, but can become aware of, such as learned skills, like riding a bike. The conscious mind is the part of your mind that you are actively aware of, the thoughts that you can hear in your head. Psychoanalytic therapy is based on finding out what in your unconscious mind is causing you to think and feel the way that you do. One way to find this out is through dreams. Freud believed that dreams were a window to the unconscious. They would show your fears and desires that you weren't even aware of. For example, any phallic imagery, specifically snakes, appearing in a woman's dream was supposed to show her underlying desire to be a man. This theory even translated outside of dreams, where he would say that anyone who was drawn to cylindrical objects might have an unconscious reason. This is where one of his most famous quotes comes from. You see, Freud was known for always smoking a cigar, and one time one of his students asked him, "Freud, if cylindrical objects are meant to represent phallic symbols, then why are you always smoking a cigar?" And Freud responded, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar," which is now a quote meaning not everything has to be analyzed in depth. Is it really just a cigar, Freud? Or do you have something to tell us? However, despite it being a very entertaining story, there's no proof that Freud ever actually said this. The quote could have been from someone else, which would make sense considering how ironic it is for him to say something like that when psychoanalytics was all based upon finding underlying meanings. Within the unconscious mind lay the id, a part of the human psyche that operates only on the pleasure principle, the idea that all that is needed in life is to find pleasure and avoid pain. The id is often compared to an infant. It is impatient, needy, and sometimes aggressive. It will do anything to gain the pleasure that it seeks. Now, thankfully, there is an opposing force, the superego. The superego is said to develop in a child as they mature. It's cultivated by their parents and by the society around them. The superego's only goal is to urge you to do what is most socially acceptable. And to help mediate these two forces so they're not always at each other's throats is the ego. The ego is the one that appears in the conscious mind the most, as it is what presents the final thought after mediating between the superego and the id's desires. Here's an example of how these three work together. Every morning my alarm goes off at 8 a.m. telling me to wake up. And when I wake up, the id is screaming at me to go back to sleep. But the superego is saying, no, get up and eat a healthy breakfast and go for a run, because that's what's best for you. So, to keep them from fighting, the ego comes in and decides that I will get up, but I'm gonna eat a Pop-Tart for breakfast. Aside from mediation, the ego is also responsible for defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are the ego's way of preventing the id's desires from reaching your conscious mind. There are 12 Freudian defense mechanisms, which is a lot, but they're all pretty fun, so bear with me. Number 1, repression. Dangerous thoughts, such as unacceptable urges and memories, are pushed into the unconscious mind and forgotten. Nowadays, that is very rare to see and most common in people with PTSD, but Freud believed it was much more common than it is. Number 2, denial. Similar to repression, but usually focuses on actual events rather than thoughts. Anxiety-producing events will be pushed to the back of the mind and barred from memory. After losing a loved one, people may avoid everything that has to do with that person, as to not remind themselves of them. That's a form of denial. Number 3, compensation. Making up for the bad aspects of yourself by exaggerating the good ones. For example, if a student is insecure about bad grades, they may push all their resources into being better at sports. Number 4, displacement. When someone expresses their unpleasant urges, but not on the original focus. A worker may be having problems at home, causing anger, but instead of taking it out on their family, who are making them angry, they take it out on their customers. Number 5, projection. When someone experiences unacceptable urges and so projects those urges onto someone else. For example, you may really start to hate one of your friends, but you don't want to admit it, so you say that they hate you. Number 6, identification. Justifying unpleasant thoughts or actions because of a group or movement you're a part of. For example, someone with a certain mental illness might excuse all their bad behavior with that mental illness, even if the behavior is completely unrelated. Number 7, introjection, in which people conform to a socially accepted norm instead of facing how they actually feel. Number 8, reaction formation. This one's my favorite, in which the ego converts unacceptable urges into the opposite. This can be found a lot in politics, like when an anti-gay politician is found out to be having a gay affair, or when a feminist speaker is secretly abusing his wife. Number 9, rationalization, when someone comes up with reasons or excuses as to why their behavior was okay. For example, it's okay that I yelled at them, they wouldn't have listened otherwise. Number 10, regression, when someone reverts to childlike behavior when presented with unpleasant feelings. For example, throwing things while you're angry. Number 11, ritual and undoing, making up for bad behavior by performing ritualistic good habits afterwards. Abusers will often follow up their abuse by showering their victim with gifts and praise. Number 12, sublimation, in which the ego takes the id's desires and channels it into something socially acceptable. For example, if you're very aggressive, then you would start a sport. That's a way to get out your anger without, blowing up. In modern research, there are even more defined defense mechanisms, but these are just the ones that Freud believed the ego controlled. And now that we have a better understanding of the unconscious, we can move on to the theory that gave birth to the Oedipus complex, Freud's theory of psychosexual development. But unfortunately, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, so that will be covered in part 2.